both for people to understand a story and also to understand other people. Now, I arrived in Britain in 1955 and to join my mother. And she sent for me to help her to work. And when I arrived, I couldn't go to work because I was 14 years and 11 months. And, you know, you couldn't leave school then in London until you were 15. And that is where my education started in this country. And without that 1 month, I wouldn't be speaking to you today. Now, and therefore my life is dependent on luck, but people's lives should not be dependent on luck, you know, and a lot of Black people's lives, you know, there is no planning as such because of the way our history, our slave history, and the way we live as migrant. You know, and therefore, when I went to school, my mother took me to school, I was designated educationally subnormal. That meant, you know, I was fitting in with David Hume's concept that Negroes are inferior to whites. That was 1753. This was 1955. However, I managed to get through the school system. I managed to eventually end up as professor in the university at Heriot-Watt University, confounding Hume's concept. However, what I believe in terms of my activism, the work I've done on slavery, is that I've used my research knowledge in terms of research on barley and my teaching of science, that evidence is critical to win an argument or to defend a position. And therefore, I've used that in my activism work with my work on slavery and with looking at Henry Dundas' statue and trying to get the council to change the narrative on it, which I believe was not true. And to do that, I relied on evidence which I got from you know, some work which I did in the early stages on abolition and slavery. I found a letter written by Gibson Craig, the MP, whose family owned Riccarton. And this letter I found in the archive at Heriot-Watt University. And nobody has seen that letter since 1838. And it's because of the content where he said, we've just, to his father in that letter, we've just had the vote for the abolition of slavery, and it was 93 to 96. And I voted for abolition and would do it again. Now, because I knew the history, that letter I found in the archive, I immediately recognized 93 and 96 as a vote. And the university has that letter now. I have a copy. But that was an important part of the beginning of my work on looking at the history of slavery. Now, I've used other information like the Jamaica telephone directory. I've also recently with Dundas, my son is a dentist in London, and he knows I'm deeply involved in this work. And he has accessed information from parliamentary sources, from looking at the internet of people who were selling original documents. And therefore, as far as my work is concerned, I don't feel challenged because I'm looking at Henry Dundas's speeches, you know, which he made in, you know, the 1790s. I'm looking at documents, which, such as my letter, which Henry Dundas wrote about going to oppose the abolition of the slave trade. I've got a letter where he says that. I've got a letter of him saying he's relating with the king's son. in terms of buying slaves to fight for the British Army. He was the Secretary of State for War at that time, attacking Haiti. And why is that important? These documents, these archival documents I have. What I think we must change is where we have academics. And this has been happening for over 200 years, where academics are, for some unknown reason, they're supporting concepts of Hume and Kant, where Hume said Negroes are inferior to whites, and Kant, made it color-coded in terms of race. And therefore, Negroes are Black, Negroes are inferior to whites, the Negro race is inferior to the white race. And that's where we are today. We have academics trying to justify that. For example, Henry Dundas is the perfect case of that, where, he, in 1792, he used the one word, gradual, to delay the abolition of the slave trade for 15 years. Wilberforce wanted immediate abolition. And he amended the bill and got it accepted that the slave trade should be gradually abolished. Now, the point is that we are now debating a statute today. My document says that the slave trade was gradually abolished because he was defending the rights, the legal rights of slave owners. That's what my documents say. He was defending the legal rights, and he put that to the Parliament. That,
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the fourth in the current series of podcasts on the theme of objectivity and neutrality in the archives. I'm John Peelan, Director of the Scottish Council on Archives, and today I'm delighted to welcome Sir Geoff Palmer, OBE, Professor Emeritus in the School of Life Sciences at Heriot-Watt in Edinburgh, Scotland, and a leading human rights activist. Geoff is the leading proponent of the movement to reinterpret the Melville Monument. He argues that because Henry Dundas proposed an amendment to the House of Commons in 1792 to achieve abolition gradually rather than immediately, he delayed abolition of the slave trade by 15 years. So today, really, I want to interview Geoff about his experience of researching Scotland's connection to the slave trade and his experience being a user of archive services. So welcome, Geoff.
Oh, good morning, and thanks for inviting me.
So, Geoff, tell me a little bit about your background, because it's really quite interesting and totally unconnected from everything I've just said,
Okay.
in terms of your historical research. But maybe you could tell me a little bit about your background and career, and then how that's particularly your story as an anti-racism campaigner and your interest in shining a light on Scotland's colonial past and its links with slavery.
Well, thank you for asking me. And I believe, in all my work and in terms of my activism, as it's now called, education is these slave owners have got a legal right to have fresh slaves, new slaves. He also said it was important for the British economy, the slave trade. And he strategies to breed slaves, young slaves. He even gave the age, 21 and 16, for 21 for men and 16 for women. He also was going to buy slaves to fight in the British Army in Haiti, where Dundas lost 40,000 men. Now, I know that he wrote to Balcarras, his governor, and there's a Balcarras Street in Edinburgh. He wrote to Balcarras to say, he's ordering him to buy slaves, and Balcarras bought the slaves fought, And once they had fought, they were re-enslaved. And Balcarres' family even got compensation for them in 1833-34. Now, that's the evidence I have. We now have historians who, because I'm saying Dundas's plaque should be changed and that he gradually abolished the slave trade for 50 years, should be on the plaque. It's not. Nothing about slavery is on Dundas's plaque. Nothing. And therefore, my campaign has been that the plaque is not telling the truth. And the truth is important for racism because people, who are prejudiced against, all they've got is the Hume comment, Negroes are inferior to white, which is a prejudice, which is not based on any evidence. And that's what killed George Floyd. That statement. The policeman in his hands in his pocket for over 8 minutes believed that Hume's right. And in our society with racism, that's still believed to be the case. And therefore, I feel that the truth must be on the plaque if we're going to change attitudes. It may be a small thing, but to me, it was an important one. And I felt I had the evidence for this. Now, historians have come along and they've said that Dundas helped Joseph Knight, a servant, between 1774 and 1778. That was a case in Perth and Edinburgh. And they reeled that out to say, but Dundas, as Lord Advocate, pleaded for Knight. He sort of, said Knight should be free. Well, of course, that's an English concept anyway. And the point is that what they leave out. So the archival evidence I have, looking at, say, the Caledonian Mercury newspaper from that period, which reported the case, which other historians have seen, that's where Dundas' statement comes from, 1776. And when I read that, it said, yes, Dundas was pleading for Knight on the basis that the English or the British heir and the Scottish heir, the heir doesn't support slavery, so he should be free. They leave out the archival evidence, which actually says that Dundas said, all Black men are slaves in Jamaica. Therefore, what Dundas was doing was just trying to have a case in Scotland, which was sort of equivalent to the Somerset case in England. It's a sort of an English-Scottish, sort of banter in terms of superiority. And within that, Dundas and the judges actually said, if Knight went to Jamaica, he'd be a slave. Thus, they were reaffirming slavery in the Caribbean. They were reaffirming British slavery, and that's what Dundas did. But that case is used, and the family of the descendant of Henry Dundas has used that a few days ago, to say, but Henry Dundas pleaded for Joseph Knight, and therefore he was a good guy then. And that should be used to balance his gradual abolition. And they're saying now, gradual abolition, because it was gradual, it was abolition. So he's an abolitionist, So he was a good guy with the Joseph Knight case, and he is an abolitionist because gradual is also an abolition concept. Now, the archival evidence I have from the Caledonian Mercury is that that's just a ruse. The point is that he actually was supporting slavery in that statement. And we have an historian saying that was an eloquent speech that, Dundas made on behalf of Knight. It's a myth, and the evidence says it's a myth. Well, now, okay, come on in.
Well, I was just going to pick you up on that, because you've talked a lot about archival evidence and truth, and that I'm really interested in the idea of archival evidence providing you irrefutable proof, and in your case of the position of Dundas. But I think from what you're saying is that 18th century mindset is still here today in terms of how it interprets what you seem to be fairly clear archival evidence, but it's interpreting with a mindset that's not that much different from the mindset of Hume and other 18th century characters.
Absolutely. The fact is that and this is part of our problem today, and it, when you're saying it, you're thinking, I can hear in the voice, that, how can that be? The point is that when people look at that evidence, the evidence clearly says Dundas was speaking and whatever, but it's not been looked at in detail as you should do as a scientist. Because when you look at that evidence from, say, the Joseph Nye case, if you look at it very carefully, the fact is that in the one statement, Dundas said there are no slaves in Britain. There cannot be from his constitution. That's not really stated much by anybody that he said that. Because then that counters the case itself, because a lot of people today are saying Henry Dundas helped to abolish slavery in Scotland by the release of Joseph Nye. Dundas says there were no slaves in Scotland, and there weren't any.
Do you also think that maybe the part of the mentality is that archives for a long time have been the preserve of historians in terms of how they're analysed and researched and interpreted?
Yeah.
When you're an academic, you're an esteemed academic, and you've been you've been given a knighthood for the work that you've done. But in terms of your research in terms of Scotland and its connection to slavery, and particularly Henry Dundas's significant role in that, you're coming in as a layperson, and maybe that's wound up the historians potentially.
Well, this is I've been referred to as a brewer. I've been referred to as an activist. I've been referred to as a chemist. I've been referred to as a grain scientist. But the point is, what I use to counteract that, and I've had a great debate with Sir Tom Devine, and you will see it in the Herald on Sunday a few weeks ago. And he didn't actually say that, but what he said was historians, we're trained. The implication is I'm not. The point is that I've got a Doctor of Science degree. That's a research degree. And research means you have a research concept, that you know how to look at things. You know what is evidence and what isn't. And they don't have that.
Well, and I suppose what this highlights is that archives are not kept just for researchers and historians. They're really for everyone to examine. But one of the things that we've touched on
they're not newspapers. They're not. No, I don't agree with that. I think that anything that is there is evidence, and you can read it as a story if you want. The Darwin is a story, but it's also evidence.
One of the themes that we've touched on in the earlier podcast, the idea of that sometimes expressed that archives are these fixed sources through time and space, but actually they're not. They are interpreted and reinterpreted by different societies and different mindsets and different cultures, depending on the prevailing culture.
But the original document doesn't change.
No, it doesn't. And do you think the original document, and this comes back to the theme of neutrality in the archives, do you think the original document is a neutral source, or has it been collected from a particular, with a particular mindset?
Well, quite agree. And the fact is that there is that as well. Who actually provided the evidence? You could say, for example, the Dundas situation was in the Caledonian Mercury. it could be the Sun of the day or the Express, and therefore it could have a bias, in terms of what was stated. But unless we can go beyond that to check the witting or the unwitting of that, then we've got what's written there. And thus we are coming from there. Now people can say it's the Caledonian Mercury, so it's a newspaper, but that's not in debate.
Thinking about our understanding or awareness of the broader history of slavery in the United Kingdom, if I could just quote you briefly, something that's on the website of the Archives and Records Association. There's a slavery and archival evidence statement, and it states, as the custodians of the nation's heritage, it is incumbent upon us to ensure this shameful period in our history is not only preserved, but is widely known. The provision of documentary evidence is central to refuting those who seek to downplay or deny the crimes against humanity perpetrated by all aspects of the slavery system. But I wondered, in terms of this documentary evidence that is referred to here and you've talked about, have you found that researching archival evidence in relation to slavery frustrating in terms of what's missing from the record, and perhaps deliberately missing from the record?
Yeah, in a sense that, what I was just talking about, the fact that Dundas said that Black people are slaves, and that, and the judges in the courts actually said the same, that is not has not been included by historians. They've left it out because it doesn't fit in then with their view of Dundas. And therefore, if you look at that, then that, to me, his behavior then is consistent with him gradually abolishing the slave trade. It's consistent. So it's additional evidence, but the point is that if you leave that out, then that is used by historians and by his relative and other people who support him to say, but he did a good job for Joseph Knight in that case, so he can't altogether be a bad person. Evidence is critical, because if you find that it is consistent from that case to him gradually, then that strengthens the position which one of his relatives, Lord Coburn, said he was a despotic dictator. That's his relative, which fits the evidence.
I wonder, could I ask you, in terms of your experience again of this historical research, has it given you a greater understanding, or has it just reinforced what you already knew about the mindset that was behind the keeping of 18th and 19th century records and the wider perception of Black people? I mean, has research in the archives reinforced your perception of that discrimination and that racism, or has it given you a better understanding?
It has given me, it's both, in a sense that if you look at the archival documents of the Joseph Knight case written by hand, okay? So they were not gone into type. So those are the original documents, which I got from one of the archives in Edinburgh. And when you look at that, I know that, the N-word is from slavery and it's negative and it's about Black people being inferior, dodgy, incapable, not got an original thought in their heads. The point is that I knew all that. The point is that when I looked at those documents, handwritten, it says in there as the argument for enslavement, slavery is legal, in the West Indies. Slavery is necessary. Black people can take the sun more than white people. So that's a justification for their enslavement. And therefore, all that is written. And therefore, when you look at that, the mindset then was to almost, it's called teleology, but it is then developing a case to justify enslavement. And when you look at that, the point is that what it also tells you, they knew it was wrong. But the point is that if you have a necessity, as they wrote, and necessity is a very important concept, then in fact they said this was wrong, but we needed the money. And that was Dundas. So the archival evidence for me provided me with an argument, which, if you're talking about methodology, the importance of a methodology in science is that the reader can go back and check the evidence that you cited, which a lot of historians and stuff like people like that thinking, Tom Devine, the basis of our argument today is, oh, he said in 2015. So that's like an archive. 2015, in his book, he said that Dundas supported, the slave owners, and they gave him grateful thanks for delaying the abolition of the slave trade for a generation. He now says he's changed his mind. But I said the evidence hasn't changed, that you left. What's the evidence that now occasion that you change your mind? And he hasn't got any. He says the French Revolution. I then says, I've got the archival statement of Dundas referring to the French Revolution, where he said in his speech in 1796 that he has no fear of the French fleet or army. He's not interested. He's more interested in slave rebellions and the French fomenting rebellion of the slaves. So here's a historian says he's changed his mind from his own evidence with a French Revolution story, which he cannot justify. And that's the critical aspect of evidence, especially what would be termed archival evidence. And that's why I managed, I think, to get the council to with the help of other people. I see it as a Scottish victory, the victory of the Scottish people rather than me. The point is that I've provided them with consistent evidence, and they have changed the plaque to put slavery on Dundas's plaque for the first time in 200 years on the basis of evidence.
I wonder, could I ask you about what you feel about the role of archivists in all of this? Archives don't keep themselves. There's a person behind that. And I wondered, do you feel, well, I mean, not so much archivists back in the 18th or early 19th century, but today, do you think archivists have a responsibility to ensure that in terms of the decision-making process on what to keep and what to dispose of, that they need to be representative of all aspects of society in their work?
I think they should have been like that before we had a diverse society.
Yes.
They should have, the very fact that they kept Dundas's letter, which a member of one of my lecturers who attended my lectures actually informed me of that. He gave me the code to the letter, and I took it, to the institution, and they searched for it, brought it out, gave it to me, and I made a copy, and they charged me £7. And that's the best £7 I've ever spent, because they kept that letter, not knowing this letter has been kept for over 200 years. And nobody knew it was going to have this effect today. So a job of an archivist, I feel, is to collect that information without any prejudices at all. And that's why an archive, if it's what I think it should be, is that the documents are collected without any prejudices or any views. Because if historians were collecting documents from my experience, then in fact some of those documents would be discarded with, because they're saying, well, I don't think that fits the story. And I think there's a very great difference between those two points of view.
That's interesting. You say you believe that archivists should you make decisions without prejudice.
Yes.
But I guess the question I was really trying to get at was, should they be making decisions based on trying to be agents for change in society, in actually not prejudice, but being subjective in terms of their decision making, and saying, well, actually, those records, although traditionally they might not be deemed to have been important, actually they will be very important, telling the stories of, say, the lives of poor people or a marginalized community. That whether archivists, being the guardians or the gatekeepers of evidence, should actually be making decisions that are not certainly not prejudiced, but also not entirely neutral either.
I think I believe they should collect what's collectible. I know they can't collect everything, but I think that if you start making that decision that this might be more important for this or that community, then in fact, you'll start putting in a judgmental basis on evidence, and therefore you would have to know the archivist did that. You see my point?
Sure.
For that evidence to be of any value, you would have to know that the archivist deliberately made that decision.
The archival sector, and it is wrestling with this problem at the moment, but the archival sector in the United Kingdom and the wider heritage sector generally, particularly in Western countries, is predominantly white.
Right.
And that's it'd be hard to argue that wasn't providing an obstacle to ensuring that the stories of Black people are part of the national documented record. And because of that, that's led to the creation of organizations such as Black Cultural Archives. And I interviewed the director, Eric Oka, as part of this series. And I wondered if that was a concern of yours, that in Western countries, the heritage is still very much the heritage of white people, and not really the stories of Black people who formed, and who've given so much to this country, but somehow they seem to have been relegated to not as important. And is that something that's still an issue for you?
No, I think a good archivist is like a good doctor. It should be able to treat, any patient. And if a doctor needs more education about treating non-white patients, he should be given it, or her. And therefore, that's how I see it. The point is that an archivist, whether they're Black or white, should collect what is available without prejudice. Because then if we're going to get, the Black history is white history as well. Because if you can't tell it without the white people involved. And therefore, I just feel that, if we've got Black archives now and white archives, it's a very sad affair, because then we will have to look at both to arrive at, a fair evidence if we're going to make decisions from. So whether it's a Black archive or a white archive, they should be collecting the same thing, the same evidence.
I wonder, are you familiar with the expression that's used quite a lot now, decolonizing the archive? It's something I've talked about with the other interviews in this podcast. But I wondered if you have any thoughts about that. It's this kind of reinterpretation of the record, an ownership of our colonial past, and taking responsibility for shining a light on that through the archival evidence. I mean, are you comfortable with that phrase, decolonizing the archive?
I always say to my students, and when people start to say things, I say, well, what do you mean by that? Could you define decolonize for me?
Well, it's not my.
Usually they can't.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's one of those phrases that everyone's bandying about and using widely, but probably, as you've done, if you sat them down and said, what do you mean by it, a lot of people would probably struggle with it.
Right, and therefore it's meaningless.
In an earlier podcast of this series, Professor Michelle Caswell spoke about the influence of, as I think had been described by another academic, the white, ethnically European, bourgeois, Christian, heterosexual, able-bodied male presence mainstream world outlook in archives in terms of what is kept and what is dismissed. And I wonder how you felt about that archives, not so much now, but certainly in the past, were very much the preserve of this, white European male, privileged section of society that give a particular outlook and take on things.
I reckon that we're in more danger of that happening today. That great long description you've just given. It is less likely to have happened, funnily enough, 200 years ago. Because then they reckon it was okay to enslave Black people. So they collected all the evidence. The evidence is there. It's what I'm more fearful of is today, where an archivist may be now being influenced because saying negative things about Black people is probably not regarded as a thing you don't want to be associated with. So the evidence is either being collected or not collected now for political and social reasons. And what I believe is the evidence of the past that has been collected is probably more reliable because they felt no need to manipulate it.
Well, that's really interesting. I wonder, could I ask you, just as we draw this conversation to close,
no problem,
about your early life? I understand you were born and lived in Jamaica until you were 14 years and 11 months old, or thereabouts. And you mentioned, I think you referenced, was it Jamaican telephone directory earlier, and I wondered, have you been able to distinguish any difference between how archives are kept in a country like Jamaica as opposed to Scotland or the UK?
I don't have any, I'm not an expert on Jamaican archives or even British archives. Mm-hmm. However, in Jamaica, I know, and I've got, copies of letters which have sent to me by the library in Jamaica a long time ago, where they've kept records of slavery. And those records, a lot of them are handwritten, and they're there. And I don't think anybody in Jamaica would have thought of destroying things because it was just a record of slavery. The point is, as I said, the danger is today that, as you've said yourself, referring to white superiority, Black views, this and that. Now, all those views we're going to make what is collected by archives extremely difficult to use as evidence of the time, which is very sad.
Well, Geoff, it's been really fascinating talking to you. I've been really enjoying the debates on social media and the press, and I've
had the trolls, but I've had some support. But I did tell the trolls that I'm from a very tough part of Kingston, Jamaica, and a very tough part of Haringey, London, and a very, not as tough part in Scotland. But I've got 3% of my genes are Viking from Shetland.
Right.
And combined with my African genes, my wife actually said, it explains a lot.
Well, I think you probably haven't made it in life until you've got a few trolls on Twitter. So, and I'm sure that with your background and your genes, you'll be able to well cope with them. So Geoff, I just good luck with your ongoing work and particularly your anti-racism work and your battle with the historians. I'm sure that all the archival evidence that you'll be able to use, you'll win out in the end. So thank you.
And thank you very much. And I just want the last word, is that
of course.
I've just said academics, institutions, because of, say, the situation with Hume or Dundas or Kant, that academic institution could change a whole load of racist attitudes and other attitudes by coming out and say, Hume said that, Dundas said that, or Kant said that, and that race hasn't got a scientific validity. That will change an enormous amount of attitudes more than any politician.
Well, that's a perfect note to end this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Geoff.